One of the great pleasures of my job is getting to work with talented filmmakers from all over the country, including sometimes on projects in St. Louis. And today we're going to be joined by King Hollis, based in Dallas, Texas, producer, director, and all-around amazing filmmaker. King, you ready to get this started?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome to the Screen Lawyer Podcast. I'm Pete Salsich, the Screen Lawyer. And joining me today on this episode is King Hollis, producer, director, filmmaker based in Dallas, Texas. King, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Pete.
I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and I'm excited about this conversation. To give people a little bit of background, I've gotten to know King in the last year. We've been working fairly closely together on a project that you've heard us mention from time to time called Spaghetti Wars, and we will dig into that. But in that process, which often happens, you get to know more about the people you work with and the other things that they do, or the things that brought them to the point where you got to interact. And I want to spend a little time with King today digging into some of those things. So King, let's start. Tell the audience sort of, a little bit about your background, kind of the work that you do generally before you got to Spaghetti Wars.
Well, I've been in the industry now for 33 years. I started making films with Moses. I was at a festival the other day. I was talking to some kids about some films that, of course, they were not born when they were produced.
Right.
So I've been doing this for a while. I started off, running around University of North Texas. Did not get my degree. That's a whole nother story.
We'll do that on a follow-up episode.
It's a crazy story. The Cliff Notes, Pete, is I posed as a student for 2.5 years.
Good.
But we'll get to that. So I was around UNT and met some fellow filmmakers, and we branched out. And I started off moving in one of the production companies into their office as just a mover. I wasn't even in business. And 2 weeks later, they hired me on a Grandy's commercial.
Okay.
And so began that journey. But prior to that, actually, I was at UNT doing short films, and we won a handful of awards for our short films. And I was directing, writing, and producing those shorts. And then fast forward the next year, I move in this company. They hire me, 2 weeks later. At that point, I had been writing my own materials since I was 19 and for years. And then I started filming at UNT, and then they got me in the business with that one gig. I got on a job. I was a PA.
Yeah, this is where everybody starts, right? Pretty much.
That's a level position, production assistant. They're like, "Hey, we want you to come PA." I'm like, "What's that?"
Right.
And so I had no idea that, in high school, I was a storyteller. I wrote short films, wrote poetry, and things of that nature, and short stories, and had a love for storytelling. And so when I moved those folks into that company, I knew I wanted to do this. I've been doing it for about a year independently. I had no idea where this ride was going to take me.
Right.
And it's taken all over the world. I've shot in many different countries, shot all over the United States. And, I've actually made a living at this crazy business.
Yeah. Which is saying something.
Yeah. It's a tough gig. But, I will tell you this. At the end of the day, Pete, I love what I do because I get to do it with who I love.
Yeah.
And so
well said.
That's a really special thing for me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, and I for my own version, I have a similar version of that. In that I think if you're fortunate in whatever career your path is, if you are able to find a way to work with people that you admire or want to be like, and not everybody you work with is always going to be like that. And I'm sure I'm not always like that for somebody else, but more often than not, if you're able to chase a dream and that allows you to work with the kind of people and the kind of projects that you love yourself, then it's not really work, or it doesn't feel like work in the same way.
Right. Absolutely.
So how'd you get into sort of the next step? Like, you started as a PA. Was there a break or a particular project that you elevated or began to take over, or did that just sort of take time?
So the interesting thing was before I became a PA, I had already produced, directed, and wrote independent for short film. So I got a taste of what that, above line feeling is, right? I was running a set. I was, budgeting. I was, organizing logistics. And so I had a little micro dose of that in the independent world.
Right.
So when I was on set, I was taught formally how to do these things.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a difference between, the education you get at colleges, whereas it's almost like, in my opinion, a lot of these film schools need to be more, almost a little more like trade schools.
Yeah. Yeah.
With a lot more hands-on integration to the industry. Well, I kind of did that on accident because as I was PAing and getting work as a PA and became like a good PA,
right.
I was still doing independent films. Like the year after that, I produced my first feature. And I'd already directed 2 short films, music video. And so I was constantly directing and producing shorts as I was getting my next PA gig and then exploring other departments. Hey, I'll be an art PA, which I hated, which I sucked at. went to G&E, grip and electric, became a grip, became an electric. Wasn't that great at it. I was a big, strong kid, and I was okay as a grip. And, I worked on the Newton Boys. I was rigging electrician for the Newton Boys. So it wasn't that I was unhireable. I just didn't have the passion for it, but I could physically do the work. Sure. I was, former athlete, big kid, whatever. And so I could do the work. And so as I was moving up and kind of going to different departments, my independent world, I just directed a feature. I directed another short. I produced a feature, directed another short, directed another short, produced another short. So I was staying in the narrative and doing that. And then at the age of at 25, I go, I'm going to start my own company. So me and my partner Ed Harris started our own company. I know nothing about nothing. Okay?
Right.
I don't know about business, something about insurance, taxation, nothing. I know how to shoot things. I'm a company. Right. And so I just jump into that. And that became kind of this entrepreneurial spirit in me where I realized that I couldn't just be an artist. Like I had to be there was this word, some guy phrase, like an entertainmentpreneur or something. It was like you had to be this film. Or you had to be all things because in the independent space, you are all things.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
The industry was I was learning from technicians, the best key grip, A-list key grip in the state that, had worked on A-list movies, the best boy, the top gaffer, the first AD team, second AD team. Like I was learning from the best line producers and all the A-listers in our market that worked on big Texas shows, but also Hollywood came to town. They were the first picks. Right. Those were my people that I studied under. And the list goes on and on of mentors that I studied under in Texas. Jeff Bednar, Snorri Nevin, Brad Morano, Steve Miller. There's countless people that, I'm leaving out 1,000 people who have my career. And so Phil Pfeiffer, who was Robert Redford's Martin Scorsese and Oliver Stone's second unit director. He was one of my mentors, and he's originally from Texas. So these are so that's how it was. It was like I'm learning technically how to do things at a high level while I'm over here independently making my own films, and constantly doing that. So I kind of had the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you really did.
Learning both at the same time.
And I think that's, I think that's a somewhat common journey, I think, for people that come up and end up in that above the line role where you are Now, in our working together, obviously as a director, but also I watch you work with the team, and everybody's involved in sort of the business structure and putting the deal together, from the financing and the distribution planning and all of those aspects of a project. But you also, to your point, maybe you weren't the best key grip ever, but you spent time in each of those different departments. You have a respect for what those departments are, why they're important, who's really good at the jobs in those departments. And yet, while, you mentioned sort of the best way to learn, in the sense that when you were comparing to, like, if you were sitting in a film school and you took a class on being a PA or a grip or any of these other things, that's useful information, but it's not the same as learning on set. And I think by the fact that you were already doing this work without really knowing what it needed, but just had a sense, well, I got to have this, I got to write, I got to direct, I got to move the set, I got to do all these things. Then when you get on a real set and you get to work with real pros, you've already created that gap in your knowledge that can be filled in, right? You've already experienced I got to try to do this, but I don't really know how. And then, now I have something. So I think it's a powerful way to learn and advance by first getting out there and making mistakes on your own, and growing from there. And I think that's when you're talking about this time period in Texas. And I remember meeting some of the folks who were up from Dallas last fall on the Spaghetti Wars set, and they were talking about, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, whenever the tax credit in Texas was really becoming a bigger deal. Because obviously, as you know, in Missouri, we now have film tax credits now we're in our second full year. And it's created a lot of energy here in throughout the state of Missouri, in St. Louis in particular. But you were sort of coming up at a time in filmmaking in Texas where there was all kinds of stuff happening at that time. Was there just a ton of energy, a lot of opportunity, or what did that feel like?
There's been different waves in the city. The Dallas film goes back to the 1920s.
Really?
Believe it or not. And interestingly enough, part of the lore of the 20s and 30s and filmmaking was there was also an early enclave of African-American filmmakers. And there's a group of films that are on nitrates plates that were once at the SMU archives.
Wow.
So there's a long history of filmmaking in Dallas. The first producer, Benji, when it came out in the 70s, was a Dallas producer. And so there was a kind of a legacy that's an unknown legacy. Actually, I've been working on developing a historical film about that, about the film history of Dallas. But when I was a kid, people remember that, Dallas was the number one show in the country.
Right.
And
right.
I actually worked with people that worked on that original show.
Wow. Cool.
And Walker, Texas Ranger. And so there was like this episodic thing going on.
Right.
But it became a really good place for an occasional A-list film to come in. And it became a place where independent filmmakers from Texas and out of Texas would come because it was good labor, but at a cheaper cost.
Sure.
And so when I got in the business, it was really a commercial market, right? A lot of agencies are there, based in Dallas. A lot of Fortune 500s moved to Dallas. So you had a lot of that going on. And then, so in the 90s, it was really like, man, independent film is popping in. The commercial thing is booming here. I mean, big campaigns were shot in Dallas that people know about. And that's kind of what it was. And then as the 2000s rolled around, technology's changing, streaming's coming, is being born. And all of a sudden, 10 years later after the millennial, people are like, hey, listen, we need to support this thing. And here comes the tax. And so, there was a big, boom of, we were already kind of established, at the time, everyone, we're going to be the third coast, and all that. And then Texas basically got left behind in the incentive process because incentives had kicked in, but we were ahead of other cities in the South, Southwest of production. but we started falling behind in incentives. So Texas dipped their toe in incentives. And, my partner Barry and I, we were guiding incentive, production in that time period. And there was an energy that was going on. But what kind of happened was the state wouldn't go far enough, and people started leaving the market. So
interesting.
After 2020 and 12, when the incentives was there, and they weren't, as strong as we need them to be, but they were at least something.
Right.
People, independent filmmakers, were trying to stay. I got personal friends, and they left. And we had people move to New Orleans, they moved to Atlanta, they moved to New Mexico. And so we had a lull where we were booming for decades. We were a production town. And in a lot of production towns, and we say, are they a 3-tier town? In other words, can I crew 3 tiers of A-list talent in one town?
Yeah.
So
really like the depth of crew. Do you have enough for multiple things going on at the time? Do you have department heads? Do you have mid-level crew? All of that. And
you crew 3 A-list crews that would kind of nearly the same time, right?
Yeah.
And we had gotten to a point where we could say, yeah, we can give you 3 crews at the same time. That started to drop off because work started, and the economy started getting affected. Advertising agencies started doing a lot of in-house productions, and agencies started doing in-house creative and all that work. Work started slowing down the agency side. Our incentives are not as strong as other states. So you start seeing some A-listers leave the market.
Right.
So that hit us. And what I anticipate now with the new incentive that's just been added to Texas, which is a big one.
Yeah.
It has some things that are weird about it that I don't like, but I think you're going to see some people actually move back home.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that we're hoping will happen in St. Louis. So we're obviously, a dozen years or more behind. And while I think you said it well, our tax incentive program here in Missouri is pretty good. It works well. It covers a lot of things. It's generous. It's the film office and the state departments that run it are genuinely, in my opinion, trying to make it work and make it work for filmmakers. But right now, the annual cap we have is too low. There's some other things about the incentive program that still create a bit of a barrier because it's not large enough to bring more than one significant project at a time here typically. And that it does have an impact on how fast we can build up to that 3-tier town. We're not there yet. But tell us a little bit. I mean, you did have an actual experience shooting in St. Louis last fall here on Spaghetti Wars, and you had to bring some of your key department heads with you from Dallas, but you also employed a big size crew, 50 plus people here from St. Louis, and tell us a little bit about that experience.
Every time, Dallas has always been a stepchild of the major markets, right? If you're from New York and LA, primarily LA, people come to town and they're very skeptical of your talent ability.
Sure.
So we know as people from Dallas, we know what that feels like because we were good enough to engage with Hollywood, but we were always like the runt brother.
Right.
And so when you go to smaller markets, okay, and I mean smaller markets specifically as in how big a production industry is there.
Sure.
Right. When you go to these smaller markets, you always wonder what the talent level is.
Sure.
That's a natural thing. But what I try to do is not to be insulting and off-putting with that because I've been that.
You've felt that, right?
We've felt that forever, right?
Right.
So I want to be very respectful in understanding that. So I get to St. Louis. I have no idea. I've never shot in St. Louis. Been to St. Louis, never shot here. The talent in St. Louis is effing crazy.
Wow.
There is a lot of talent in St. Louis. The camera operators are amazing. And these kids can shoot.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, call me, but I'm an old man. These kids can shoot their asses off. Most of these guys, these operators in town are owner operators. They have their own rig. and they're all DPs.
Right.
And there's, Stephen Greyhouse. I mean, there was so the first ACs were fantastic.
Right.
Camera department was crazy. Art department, crazy, talented, hardworking. Grip Electric, these guys know their stuff.
Yeah.
These guys are on point. There was so many talented people on set. Hardworking sound guys. It was like a breath of fresh air to be in the market. And I was like, this town is slept on.
Yeah.
This is a well-kept secret that doesn't need to be a secret for. Although selfishly, I don't want anybody to come and want to work with all my guys.
Right. No, I get you. That'll be our job is to, and I think it's so good to hear. And I've heard you say that before. It's why I wanted our listeners to hear that experience, because that's what I've always believed, but I don't know what that feels like to somebody coming in from out of town. And I know that the excitement level here for the opportunity to, again, and most of those people are like you were, right? They're also writing, directing, producing their own shorts, their own features, that sort of thing. But now they're getting a chance to work on some more and more serious size productions, bigger budgets, all of those things, and work with real pros, right? And you guys pulled off an insane amount of production in about 4 days' time. Which is still kind of remarkable. I remember spending time over on the set when you were here, and it was like a little city had dropped down in the middle of the hill Italian neighborhood here for 4 days and just took it over. But it was really cool to watch how, I'm sure it wasn't seamless, but it kind of appeared seamless to an observer like myself who knows a little bit about it, but really doesn't know all the inner workings.
Yeah, I mean, every production has bumps. We were moving fast. We were also getting to know people. We were Brady Bunch in the crew, right?
Right.
And so, there's shorthands that you don't have, or shorthands with the guy you do have.
Right.
But I thought my Dallas crew was in love with St. Louis crew.
Oh, that's great.
For the most part.
Yeah.
There's, you can get personality issues
here
and there. That's like any game, any sport, right? But
right.
The overall sentiment was that everybody wants to come. First of all, I'm in love with St. Louis. I fell in love. My son's, Dad, where you going? I'm going to the Lou. Going to the Lou. And but it was great. I mean, it was, for what we did, it was tough.
Sure.
But that proves that. Let me tell you something. That production told me everything I need to know about St. Louis crew. That was a tough gig.
Right.
That was a very tough gig. The way people were composed, the way they problem solved, the work ethic, they gave of themselves to make this, the integrity that they held in the work that they did was over the top. And it wasn't an easy production. It was one. Let me tell you something, Pete. I told you, I'm doing this for 33 years. That was the hardest production I've ever done. Yeah. That was tough. And I've done some tough shoots. I did a feature film in 23 days. And this was a period piece with aerial stunts,
wow,
with dogs and kids. Okay. And this, I would say, was tougher than those 23 days.
Wow. And so you were condensed, you had so much condensed and you had so many moving parts, right? You had 6 cameras, you had the live event component to it. And for people who have maybe heard me reference Spaghetti Wars, we're very excited you guys are getting ready to go into post. We're excited about what that looks like coming out later this year. I think people are going to be excited to see it. And that's something that is encouraging. We have other things coming to town as well. And there's a buzz about this that's happening. And we're thrilled that you guys had that experience and look forward to you guys coming back. Let me ask you something, sort of shifting gears a little bit, because I always find this is kind of an interesting conversation. First of all, we could probably keep talking here for a couple of hours and barely scratch the surface. So we will have to come back and do this again. But I want to sort of wind up a little bit here this morning and respect your time by asking you this simple question. And I ask this of all my guests. What's on your screen? And however you answer that question is appropriate. So, I ask it to sometimes people and they immediately pull out their phone and they think of a game they're playing or this YouTube channel they've just found. Somebody else will talk about the latest, thing they watch on their wall at the end of the night, and it might be on Netflix. Somebody else's, it's the script I'm writing, whatever. So I'm curious, if I ask you right now, what's on your screen?
On my screen right now is a curated channel of content that I am developing,
Cool,
and producing and directing and writing. And that screen has a feature film about only the second African American military person to win the Navy Cross.
wow,
That's been in Hollywood for about 6 years that we've been developing. It's a project that's starting in St. Louis about a very famous diamond.
yep,
There is a story that I have about a female MMA fighter who was victimized as a child and turned that into her art. But she uses her art form to get out of that. She's an incredible artist. Yeah. She also uses martial arts mentally to stay together. And that's a story that we've actually filmed. We have in the can. So on my screen is a lot of stories that come from a lot of places that, it's hard to look at my screen and go, well, this guy makes this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I go for the great story. And sometimes that's unscripted work. And sometimes that's a film. And sometimes it's a documentary. But it's all an adventure in the story. And the last thing I would say that on my screen is telling historical films and telling stories about humanity through documentary form that can make impact on people's lives and change people's minds. And sometimes when needed, change policy in the country. Yeah. Those are the things that's on my screen.
Very cool. Well, you have a busy screen. But I think that's what excitement. I mean, when I've had a chance to engage with you and the team, it is always energizing. It is busy. There's a lot going on, but there's always this sort of happy, excited energy about what's next or what's, on the screen. We used to say on the drawing board. Well, now it's on the screen. It's in the development side. But, well, that's very cool. Well, I'm going to hold you to coming back later when some of those things leave that place where you're curating and become something we can watch or hear more about. Because I think that's very exciting stuff. And I'm glad to know that you have that in the works and that you will be back in St. Louis before too long as we get ready to bring the first Spaghetti Wars episode to the screen itself. Hey, King, thank you so much for taking the time today. Been a blast catching up. Really appreciate it. Folks, if you've enjoyed this episode here with King Hollis, you can follow him. King, how would people get to learn more about you, connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And my Instagram, just type in King Hollis and my crazy Instagram name will pop up.
All right.
Which is Don Holissimo. So it's on.
So, all right, folks, you can check him out on Instagram and LinkedIn, and that will probably lead you everywhere else you need to go to find more about King Hollis and the amazing work that he does. And if you've enjoyed this content, if you like this podcast, find us, follow us wherever you get your audio podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like and subscribe button. You can see good-looking people like me and King all the time. And you can always find us at thescreenlawyer.com. Thanks a lot, everybody. King, take care. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Pete.